But we'll go ahead. That's it. That's what I have, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
Given your understanding of PERA and your knowledge of the politics within which it exists, what do you think is most likely going to happen?
I think now that there's an understanding, even by a Democratic governor, that this is not tenable. What's going to happen? There's a big portfolio of things that can happen. But I think what's likely to happen is that they will require additional employer contributions. They will probably try to encourage people to move into the defined contribution plan, but won't require it. And I'm afraid that what we'll try to do is sort of turn the ship. This is this big ship headed toward an iceberg, right? And the angular momentum of this thing is colossal, and it's hard to get it to turn. And I have a feeling that's what's going to happen, is that we'll try to make a series. There will be changes made, but they'll probably be too small, unless there's a real public groundswell behind making more substantive changes. It is entirely possible that, for instance, raising the retirement age will have to be done by a ballot initiative, or something that forces the conversion over to a defined contribution plan will have to be done by a ballot initiative. We have that option. Thank goodness here in Colorado we can do that. And so that may be the way that ultimately things really get done. Yes.
Josh, just a question, clarification. Notice on a couple of these charts, the one on your second page, and it's repeated a couple other instances, there's a real massive spike between the year 2000 and the year 2002, 2004. Can you explain what caused that to happen? Because that's, the rest of it, you get some certain normal fluctuations, but that is a real anomaly.
That's a good question. And that's really the two things that I mentioned before. The stock market going down. Instead of reallocating the assets every year, saying we're going to have a target of 55%, which I think is what their target is now, between 55 and 60% in equities. Instead of having that target, they let it ride, and you ended up with 75% in equities. The stock market bubble burst, the dot-com bubble burst, and suddenly all that money wasn't there, and it wasn't there to reallocate. And then the other part was the purchase service credit, because what ended up happening, that's on the liability side. What ended up happening was you purchased the service credit for pennies on the dollar, not quite pennies on the dimes on the dollar, and so now you're creating this additional obligation, right? Now you owe somebody money for years that they should have been contributing, for years that we should have been contributing. Those contributions aren't there. And so that was really the other reason. The fire sale stopped once. There was 1 year. I want to say it was 2000. There was 1 year where the greatest amount of money coming into the state fund, was from people purchasing service credit, not from employee contributions, not from employer contributions, but from purchase service credit. That gives you a sense of how attractive that deal was. And we're paying for it now. We're going to be paying for it for the rest of our lives.
So basically it was a double whammy, one external factor, one factor internal to PERA.
Yeah, that's right. And one on the asset side and one on the liability side. So you basically have those two teaming up on you. Right.
Quick question about Amendment 66 was recently defeated, and there were some issues around Amendment 66.
Yeah.
Yes. Thanks in part to some people in this room, including I think you, and to a certain extent Chris there as well. But
at least you're kind enough to tell me that you're recording me.
Yeah. To what extent was that a bailout for PERA, and what was the relationship between that ballot initiative and the state of PERA?
Yeah. When it was sold, when Amendment 66 was written, they really tried at the state level to make sure that the money couldn't go directly to PERA. That is the state contribution. The problem was that the state doesn't make a direct contribution to PERA for the school fund. The school districts do that because they are the employers. The state makes a direct contribution for the state fund or the judicial fund or the police fund. It doesn't make a contribution for the school fund because the state doesn't employ teachers. It employs some, I suppose, at the higher education level, but not at the bulk, which is at the high school or the public school level. So once that money got to the schools, it would have made it easier for the districts to continue to do what they shouldn't have been doing, which is swallow the entire obligation, the entire supplemental payment that they have to be making, rather than pushing that back onto the teachers. And we got the governor to admit that as much, and that may have had some effect on how people approached it when they were voting on it. But it was not a direct funding of PERA, but it would have allowed the districts to continue, in essence, picking up a tab that rightly belonged to, at least half of which rightly belonged to the employees. So, Christina.
You talked about an honest accounting for the discount rate. And you talked about how it was 8%, it's now 7.5%. You think it should be lower than that? Tell me how that works.
So discount rate, that's a really good question. Discount rate is a difficult concept even for people, even for business people, even for people who've been through B school. It's a difficult concept for people to get. And so let me walk you through an example of how that works. Everyone understands future value. That's the 8% or the 7.5% now, right? You have you have $100,000 today. 8% is good because the math works out nice and clean. You have $100 today. Okay. If you compound that at 8% for 30 years from now, you will have, let's say $100, so you have $1,000. You'll have 10 times that amount. That's the future value 30 years from now of that money that you have today. Everybody understands that. Why? Because time runs forward. Right? Time doesn't run backward. I guess, in some universes it does, but not this one. On this one, we got to worry about future value. But you have this obligation. So what do? How do you get obligations into today's dollars? Obligations that you're going to be owed 30 years from now. Let's say you're owed $1 million 30 years from now. How do you value that in today's dollars? You use what's called a discount rate. Moving forward, it's called an interest rate. Moving back, it's called a discount rate because you're discounting that a certain amount per year to get what that's worth to you in today's dollars. And the way that you, in terms of the market, value that thing out in the future, that obligation out in the future, is by how secure that investment is. So the more secure the investment, the more that promise is worth to you, right? I mean, if let's pretend that the federal government is going to continue to be able to pay its obligations. Let's pretend that that's the case. So it's 1960. We're all going to be retiring in 1990. This is, that's a pretty solid obligation. The economy basically runs on the idea that the federal government will be able to pay its debts, be able to pay its obligations. If they make a promise to you 30 years from now, then that's about as sure a thing as you're going to get. So you're going to use essentially what you expect the inflation rate to be. Maybe a little more, but it's not much. And that's the long term. That's a 30-year T-bill. T-bond. If I make that promise to you, you don't know me so well. And frankly, I don't have $100,000 that I can put in there. I'm going to have to invest this a little more aggressively. Maybe I have to go and ask people for some money to put into this. And with the promise that they'll get the overage, I have to work a little bit for this. So, you're probably not going to consider that to be as secure. It's going to be worth less to you. You're not going to give me $100,000 for that. You're going to give me, in all honesty, probably not a whole lot, but let's pretend I'm, investment guy. You're going to give me maybe $10,000. Much higher discount. Because that $10,000 needs to appreciate at a much higher number. But again, if you're working backwards, the discount rate that you use is a much higher interest rate. It's a much higher number. So the state is somewhere in between. The state actually, there's a sense that may be a contractual obligation. It's not clear how the courts are going to rule on that in Colorado. But the long-term cost of borrowing right now for the state of Colorado is somewhere around 4.5%. Let's say that that's in essence, the risk associated with that obligation. That gets set by the market. It's not set by how much you personally think it's worth or how much I personally think it's worth, how much the state says it's worth. The market's basically said if Colorado wants to borrow over the course of 30 years, they're going to have to pay 4.5%. That's how solid they think Colorado's finances are. So that's how secure that promise is to you, about 4.5%, which means that it's a much bigger number than 8%, 7.5%. So if you put that obligation, $1 million, in today's dollars, it's bigger than $100,000. If I have $100,000, why? Because it's a lower interest rate. If I have $100,000 today, I may think I can get 8%, but there's going to be a lot more variability. There's going to be a lot more risk associated with that 8%, which means, again, if I'm paying money out every year, there's an excellent chance that if I start off with, if I gear my investment to 8%, there's an excellent chance I'm not going to have that $1 million. And so what I want to do is match risk. I don't want to shove that risk off on you. I want to match risk. I want to make sure that the risk associated with my investments matches the risk that you see associated with your investment in me. And what PERA is doing is it's using its rate of return. It's using that 7.5% as the discount rate. In effect, what it's saying is that if I'm PERA, what I say I owe you, what I say the value of this obligation is not what you say the value of the obligation is. It's not what the market says the value of the obligation is. I say that obligation is worth $100,000. The market says that obligation is worth $200,000. And I'm pulling it out. I'm not sure that that's actually right, but that's just for the sake of argument. Well, there's a problem there. Because you and I don't agree on what that number is. They ought to be using the market rate of return on a 30-year. The state can't borrow unsecured money, but essentially it can. We'll go over certificates of precipitation. Certificates of participation the next time I come out. We'll talk about that. That's a whole other story. But in essence, the state's able to borrow at 30 years at about 4.5%. That's the number that they ought to be using because that's the risk associated with this investment. So that's why the discount rate is wrong. And it has a perverse incentive, by the way, because the perverse incentive is for the state to pursue riskier investments in order to have a higher rate of return, in order to make it look like that obligation is even lower, in order to make it look like they're better funded. Now, there's no evidence that they're actually doing that. There's no evidence that they're shifting stuff into riskier investments in order to do that. But there's plenty of evidence that other states have done that, that other pension funds have done that. And by the way, government pension plans in the United States are the only pension plans in the world that can get away with this. Private pension plans have to use, if you're a large company that has a private pension plan, you have to use the AAA. There aren't too many AAA companies anymore, but AAA, AA, high-rated corporate bonds. Why? Because that's a risk associated with your company. If you're a European or a Canadian pension plan, you have to use the long-term cost of borrowing of that government, of that whatever government the pension's associated with. The only people that get away with this trick are are public pension plans in the United States. So really, they shouldn't be allowed to get away with this trick. That was a long answer to a question.
Who sets the rate?
Which rate?
The discount rate. Who's doing that?
PERA sets what they believe the expected rate of return on their investments is.
That's the board of directors?
It's the PERA board, yeah.
Which are all PERA members?
Mostly PERA members. The only non-PERA member is the state treasurer. Right. Everybody else is a PERA member. There is some incentive for them, certainly, to do that, but for most of these guys, for many of these guys, that's not their primary source of income. That said, it's clear there's a conflict of interest, and any good corporate governance would tell you want to have more outside directors. They have virtually no outside directors. So, there was a question over here? No? Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I do have a question. So it seems like you're proposing solutions to a broken system. Mm-hmm. So why not get rid of the system?
Good luck.
Yeah, and that's fine. We can phase it out. But if the system is broken, why not move to the abolishment of the Department of Education, privatization of education? When you say employer contributions, that's my tax dollars. Mm-hmm. You're hiding it underneath, you said it yourself that this is a trick that only the United States government can get away with. It needs to be abolished.
I think by the time you persuaded, understand this is a state pension plan, not a federal one. So getting rid of the State Department of Education is like part of it, but you still have school districts. Getting rid of the public schools, by the time that happens, will already be bankrupted because of PERA. Right? I mean, I think the idea is to kind of sort of get a handle on the problem and create solutions that have some immediacy just directly bearing on that problem itself. Certainly we can have the discussion about the proper role of government, how big it ought to be. It ought to be a lot smaller, I think. Everybody in this room thinks it ought to be a lot smaller. But even if we converted tomorrow to a defined contribution plan, just cut it off, okay, and said it's now a defined contribution plan, you'd still have this promise that was out there that's unfunded. So you still have to deal with that problem. And that's where I'm approaching. Yes, sir.
His question raises the time-old issue, an issue that the Republican Party represents in spades, and that is the constant tug-of-war between what intelligent, competent people believe can be done and what radical, visionary people that know as much believe ought to be done. Now, I don't have an answer, but when people stand up and agree, yeah, this ought to be done, but we can't do it, here's what we can do. You give the illusion of solving the problem. And everybody in this room ought to understand today, 2014, that we are on the edge of the precipice.
I don't disagree. Right? As I say, in Colorado, well, I'm also not here representing the Republican Party. Right? I'm here representing the Independence Institute myself. So I can't speak for what certain legislators are not willing to vote for. I will tell you that it is certain specific legislators on committee. I can't speak for any of that. I can tell you that we do have, as I say in Colorado, we do have an initiative process that allows us to do certain things that other states don't have, and that we might want to start thinking about taking advantage of that. I don't think that the courts, I don't think that the law will allow us to wholesale, cut off people who are 77 and retired. We're not just going to be able to get rid of that unfunded obligation. But what we can do is keep it from growing. And I think that's our first priority, is put a dam in front of this thing and keep it from getting worse. And then we have plenty of time, and legitimately plenty of time, to pay it off once we keep it from getting worse.
With all due respect, John, the courts may not allow it, but arithmetic may.
That's why you keep it from not getting worse. That's why you keep it from getting worse. That's why you put that wall in front of it and say, listen, this is as big an unfunded obligation as we're going to have. We're not going to keep adding people to the system at a rate where they are going to contribute less, and we, the taxpayers, are going to contribute less than we're going to end up owing them in the long run. And once you put an end to that, then there actually is a fair amount of time to deal with it. This is not going to bankrupt the state tomorrow. The size of the obligation is not such that tomorrow somebody's going to come with a bill and is going to say, by the way, you have to pay all of this tomorrow, and we're not renewing your lease. That's not how this obligation works, where it's paid out over a period of years. And so if we can stop it from growing, then we do have a fair amount of time to deal with it in a relatively in a way that we're relatively able to do. And it would be nice if we cut some other stuff to free up some money to be able to do that without having to raise taxes. Because at this point, I don't think that we need to be raising. I agree with you. We certainly don't need to be raising taxes. So, yes.
When you talk about a trick, when people hear the word trick, They think of manipulation. They think of a willful desire to do this. And I'm not asking for specifics, but I'm asking based on your immersion in this subject and experience with this, how much of what's going on would you say is actual manipulation and people trying to hide things or fudge or manipulate the system? How much is naivety? And specifically, when we're talking about the PERA board, how many of the people, not specifically those people, but just in your experience, I'm trying not to pigeonhole you into making accusations, but how much of what is going on is a problem of naivety and not understanding the problem, and how much is people trying to game the system? Would you just generally not?
No. I mean, that's a reasonable question. I mean, I can't get inside of somebody's head, so I can't really know whether Greg Smith, again, he's the executive director, and he spends a lot of time talking about PERA. I can't know whether or not he really understands that the discount rate is wrong. There is some disagreement on that. I know the public pensions have been, pounding the table for years, arguing that their assessment is right and the rate of return is really what ought to be used. I don't know whether or not he sincerely believes that, or whether or not he's just sort of looking the other way because the consequences are too difficult to bear, or whether he really understands that that's not right and that it ought to be fixed, but he is just not going to fix it. I don't know. To me, that's the biggest point of contention in terms of where something is where there's a disagreement on how to account for all of this. The actuarial stuff is pretty good. The actuarial stuff is actually really good. And they really get audited on that. They spend a lot of time trying to understand how many of these people are going to retire, how many of these people are going to leave before they're eligible, how many of these people are going to die, when, and based on current ages and expected hiring and so forth. They really pound that hard, and that's the most predictable part. The unpredictable part is the investment, and to that extent, I think there is a mixture of willful blindness and just not necessarily understanding it is a perpetual argument between the financial economists and the actuaries. But it's a perpetual. But as I say, in Europe, they've decided on the side of the financial economists that the private pensions all have to use that lower discount rate. So it's unclear to me why they think they get a special. I think they get a special deal. Why the Government Accounting Standards Board continues to give them this break on this. So, yes.
Help me. Brief question. Would it be possible, first off, to remove both the perverse incentives, the lack of perhaps competence or technical expertise, by taking PERA out of the hands of government and essentially privatizing it, giving it over to an organization that is focused on running pensions and does not have the political perverse incentives and the lack of accountability due to political cover via appointments, that they actually had to be answerable completely just to the bottom line? Is there a way to get from where we are now to something like that?
Yeah, I think that's the idea behind making it a defined contribution plan. And what you could do is, and one of the nice things about, again, the 457B, which I threw out there because I think it solves certain political problems, is that you could take that. For instance, I think right now the 457B is run almost entirely by BlackRock, which is a private investment company. You could take that and you could say, listen, this is what you have offered to you, and you could slim down the management obligations of PERA pretty easily by doing that. You don't have to do that, but I think once you take away the promise versus the asset, I think you get rid of a lot of those incentives. And that, I think that ends up solving a lot of that problem. And I think you could take it and say, listen, you don't have, if you wanted to take it that next step and say, listen, we don't want to have public employees managing the money. We want to just turn it over, and here's your pension, and you can either take a 401k and invest it yourself, or you can take the 457B and invest it with BlackRock, or however you want to do that. You can get rid of a lot of that problem. I don't think you can completely privatize pensions for public employees. Because I think at some point, I mean, they're going to be paying into, their public employees. There's going to be a government, which is to say a taxpayer contribution to all of that. So you're still going to want to maintain. I mean, the check's got to go somewhere. The check is going to end up going to some agency that writes another check out to BlackRock. But I think you can slim that down pretty severely, and that would end up solving a lot of that.
I guess it's not just the management of it; it's also the fact that the taxpayers are on the hook for promises made by politicians who are not on the hook, and that I think is really the root of the problem.
It is, and again, as I say, once you convert it over to where they're no longer making promises, then I think you end up solving that, at least that incentive part of the problem. All right. Well, thank you very much. You guys have been a great crowd.